Check. 1, 2. Check. 1. Okay, I couldn't figure out other audio things hooking up, so this is going to the receiver
current research projects that I'm working on now deal with how to utilize critical race theory in education as a way to push schools and colleges and universities, but mostly schools, to, for lack of a better term, do the right thing around race and other aspects of diversity. A little background here. What I've been doing is working with a couple of with two APs at a middle school here in the Salt Lake area, and what we've been trying to do is instill a sentiment around critical race theory and its major tenets, and then utilizing that in terms of changing administrative practice so that the theory doesn't so much rest its laurels on critique, but saying, how do we spur school districts into action? How do we use critical race theory as a means to get our teachers and principals and guidance counselors into really making sure that equity and racial social justice is practiced in every aspect of school leadership, school administration, teacher-student relations, and particularly around the health and well-being of young people as well as their academic achievement. So what we've been doing basically in this one middle school that we've been doing a case study on is using the ways in which the teachers at this one middle school talk about how much they love their kids. Most of the kids at this particular school are Black and brown. Some of them are from refugee status, and they came in with a lot of issues around and challenges that the teachers had to face. On the surface, the teachers say that they love the kids, they really like working with them, they like working with the families, but when it comes down to actual test score data and achievement data, there's a disconnect between the love that they profess that they have for the kids versus what is not happening, and it centers around the normalization of failure. And this is a term that I picked up from Pedro Noguera when I was talking with him last year when I was at UCLA. Pedro talks about this whole normalization of failure, and that if you don't disrupt that ethos, you can't use the techniques and policies and practices around changing schools to make any difference in the lives of youth. The basic cultural beliefs and core characteristics of a school are embedded within this normalization of failure that spreads from the leadership through the faculty, through the staff. And so what we've been trying to do is disrupt those patterns of normalization of failure from the teachers in terms of their belief systems to changing the ways in which they interact with the students around the curriculum to even basically talking to the school resource officers about the ways in which they cannot think about 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds in criminal ways, but to think about them in terms of what does this mean if I go ahead and arrest a kid who's 12 instead of talking through them with them about discipline issues, and also telling the kids about racial realism and what Derek Bell talks about with respect to what that means if you get caught up in the criminal justice system at this young age through school discipline issues. So that's my latest research that I've been working on. We've got an article coming out in Race, Ethnicity, and Education sometime later on in 2019, and I'm trying to work on a book prospectus to pull together and send it to Teachers College Press. But I'm using that as a way to start to talk about the origins and genealogy of CRT and then lead it up to now. If those of you who aren't familiar with critical race theory, it came out of a set of discussions that were taking place at Madison, Wisconsin in the late 80s and University of California, Berkeley in the late 80s, and also at Harvard Law School. And basically what it started out doing with the scholars who were the foundational persons in CRT, such as Derek Bell, Mari Matsuda, Kimberly Crenshaw, Margaret Montoya, and others, was that as the legal, as American jurisprudence started to take shape around using social science evidence in the 1930s and 40s through some law schools that were prominent in the legal realism movement, such as the University of Wisconsin Law School, Cal Berkeley, and others, it moved into using social science evidence as a way to push the law into deciding on using those parts of social science as evidence to also utilize the law to make particular changes in law in modern society around the adjudication of basic rights around labor, around social justice issues in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, which is why you started to see more of those legislation around child labor laws and other labor laws take place in the United States during that time. It culminated, too, in the Brown decision, where you saw a prominent role of social science evidence through the Kenneth Clark Dahl studies, making a significant impact on the ways in which the decision shaped the ruling that ended separate but equal schooling and reversed Plessy versus Ferguson. Out of that era, you started to then see a movement toward critical legal studies in the early 1980s. And this was a movement led by scholars such as Roberto Unger and David Carius at Harvard, and later went on to Temple Law School. And that movement was really focused on how do we really talk about the law and its impact on social class issues around, let's say, the corporate ways in which the law actually protects capitalist interests. And so they adopted more of a Marxian analysis, for lack of a better term, in terms of how the law was supposedly used to try to protect workers' rights and elements of labor, but really ended up talking about trying to protect social class interests, particularly of corporations. As the critical legal studies movement started to take place in certain law schools like Harvard and Berkeley and Wisconsin, a group of scholars such as Bell and others started to ask a lot of questions and say, well, wait a minute, that's a great position to take. And it is legal, and when we take a look at it, it has a certain degree of truth around what it stands for with respect to the connection of capitalist interests to the American legal system. But it was missing the critique of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which was race. And so what happened out of those two conferences that took place in the late 1980s was Bell and Crenshaw and Delgado and others started to push for the inclusion of critical race theory. And out of that movement came a set of principles that has guided the field. Now, critical race theory didn't come out of a vacuum. It came out of the struggles that were taking place in ethnic studies and gender studies during the time in the 1960s and 70s on major college campuses. It came out of a set of disciplines that were taking place and changing the ways in which we thought about campus curriculum and making it more inclusive. And so there was a great deal of work that was already being done in fields like history, political science, sociology, Black studies, Chicano studies, women's studies, Asian American studies, that were all sort of fueling the academic enterprise that critical race theory was making its mark on in the law schools. And that's what the critical race theory was borrowing from. It was also borrowing from some of and I mentioned his name, Derek Bell's seminal work on what he talked about in terms of storytelling. He used storytelling, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with Bell's work on storytelling, to make a point. And the main point was that he wanted to use stories and counter stories and counter narratives to speak back to the ways in which the law was being used in these supposedly race-neutral ways, but had a deleterious impact in terms of the effect of the law. So let's say you're taking a look at the civil rights law of employment discrimination, Title VII. He would teach a class on employment discrimination, but then he would look at the stories that people would say that talked about the shortcomings of Title VII and say, okay, let's juxtapose this ways in which Title VII is supposed to eliminate discrimination based on race, but then we see how it still works out in numerous insidious ways that have a deleterious impact on people related in terms of their race, and then later on in terms of looking at gender. So, and other aspects of difference. So it was these ways in which the CRT scholars were infusing the use of counter stories and counter narratives as a teaching tool, and also to have people see the flip side of what results with respect to how the law is not neutral and how it has these deleterious impacts in terms of people, in terms of what it should be doing, but what it wasn't doing around alleviating the civil rights problems that were taking place at the time. So you've got principles such as interest convergence, whiteness as property, the intransigence of racism despite of civil rights laws, and also the ways in which critical race theory emerged as a theoretical framework to ground itself in the positionality and history and materialist goods of what was not happening for persons of color at the time. Critical race theory emerged from that era and then started to move in the different genealogies and trajections after that initial work in the 1980s and 90s. So you started to see CRT move in the different areas, such as LatCrit, which was mostly focusing on how do we apply critical race theory to the Latinx population. And so you've got some different, similar tenets, but we're being come at differently around language, around national origin, around ways in which immigration fell into play, and the legal aspects of what that means for Latinx populations. It also moved into Asian American studies in terms of what it means to be an honorary American, particularly around the affirmative action issues. And you can see that in some of the discussion that's been going on around affirmative action diversity in the Harvard admissions case that's going on now. It also moved into looking at critical race feminism, which is how it is that race and gender play these roles in terms of shaping the lives of women of color. I always like to use the example for my students of if you take two Latino women, one looks like Cardi B and another one looks like Ugly Betty in the TV show. And if you take those two examples and say, who are you going to hire in terms of a company, in terms of what it means? Then you got to sort of talk about working identity. Then you got to talk about the ways in which women of color have to face these double binds around whether you sue under race discrimination or gender discrimination. And it brings up a whole ways in which the intersectionality thesis that Kimberly Crenshaw talked about comes into focus. It also comes into play in terms of looking at the violence that happens toward women, and also comes into play that I'll talk about later on in terms of the discipline that's meted out to Black girls in schools. So critical race feminism also came into fruition after the initial sort of wave of critical race theory. So that would be like the second wave. It started to move into education in around 1995 with the peak publication of the seminal piece by Gloria Ladson-Billings and William Tate in Teachers College Record called Towards a Critical Theory of Race in Education. And what they basically argued in that seminal piece was, how do we look at the ways in which policies and practices in schools can be examined and explored through critical race theory? And they took a look at particular areas such as curriculum and school finance, and in terms of everyday school operations, and that piece that served as a way in which education started to adopt critical race theory in numerous ways that have just been an incredible explosion right now. I would say that critical race theory has moved into particular areas in education, such as the examination of education finance, and you can take a look at some of Enrique Aleman's work at U Texas San Antonio and his early work that he's looked at on CRT and that application. It's also been used in education and looking at community cultural wealth, and I would look at the work of Tara Yoso. And Yoso has talked about how CRT can be applied to how we can look at communities, not in terms of a deficit model that has been traditional, but how CRT can be looked at in terms of ways in which we can rely on the community cultural wealth as a source of strength and a source of resiliency and a source of hope and optimism that is embedded within the communities, particularly in Latinx communities across the nation, around what it is that they want for their kids and how the schools can help them get to that point. You can also take a look at CRT and how it's connected to criticisms around higher education and what that has meant around what a standard of diversity means and what a critical mass means from the 2003 Gutter decision and from the 15 Fisher decision at the University of Texas, Austin. So there's a lot of scholars who have talked about that, such as Octavio Villalpando, Tara Yoso again, Lindsay Perez-Zuber, who's at Cal State Long Beach, and others who have talked about the issues around diversity and affirmative action in higher education. It's also been moving into looking at critical race theory as a methodology in terms of the use of that in qualitative and quantitative research. The quant crit has been a new area that I've just been engaging in, but there are some key people in law and education who have done some work on this. Most notably, David Gilborn, and also some other scholars who have used quantitative methods along with critical race theory to look at issues related to policies and its impact on students of color and how to alleviate that through political action, through policy analysis that is critical, that changes school practice, and also through law. I would also say too that critical race theory has made its mark in qualitative research, for sure, in terms of the use of narrative and the use of counter narratives and the use of counter stories. Those have been critical and have been really critically important in terms of the lifeblood of people using CRT as a methodology to interrogate racism in K-12 schooling. So I would say the most notable person who's done a lot of work on this has been Adrienne Dixon at the University of Illinois. Adrienne has done some fantastic work. She's got a piece that came out, I think, in International Journal for Qualitative Studies in Education in 2013 with Danielle Cook on using composite counter stories to document the African-American teacher displacement in New Orleans schools post-Katrina and how that has played a role in shaping the ways in which it literally changed the discourse around schools that were failing versus the charter school movement in New Orleans that's going on now, and the way schools used to be in terms of their connection to Black communities in New Orleans. So I would say that her work has really been fantastic in terms of looking at the use of composite counter stories in critical race theory as a methodology. I think now the key areas that I see critical race theory going as a methodology as well as in education is looking at the ways in which you can use CRT to examine what Moesha O'Keefe talks about in her 2014 Harvard Educational Review article, the kinesiology of race. And what I mean by that is that I think that CRT and where it's going as a way that you can use it in education can be to break down, it's almost like looking at a movie and looking at a movie backwards and seeing, okay, what happens at the scenes that create the lead up to a student getting into the principal's office around a particular issue, and that student has to be a student of color. What critical race theory, I think, is going to be going on to now is looking at the frame by frame analysis of what happened to that student. And if you start to take a look at it from a racialized, a CRT standpoint, you can start to look at the relationships and interactions that took place around the student and the teacher, the student, let's say, before he or she even got into school and what was going on then what happened around the incident, and then what happened post-incident, and then how does that lead to administrative and instructional actions that need to take place for the equity of the student's interest, as well as for the equity for the school, and then how that can lead to change that takes place both in terms of school culture and school policies to disrupt the normalization of failure. So that's kind of where I see critical race theory moving into. It's something that I've tried to look at with my just administrative practice now as an associate dean in the Honors College, because we've got the University of Utah is trying to do the right thing around engaging more students from the big high schools that we have on the west side of the Salt Lake Valley that are mostly Latinx, Pacific Islanders, some African American, and some African refugees, and also a lot of first generation students, to move the needle in terms of getting those students, quote unquote, college ready. And so what I've been trying to do with the data that we have from the Honors College is basically talk to the leadership to say, how can we use the data from what we've got for students to move the needle around key issues that will really get your kids college ready, which is having them take more AP classes, having them break out of the issues, the way in which guidance counselors will push kids into different aspects that don't push them academically, and then also to change the teachers so that there's higher expectations, and to work with more of the families and to move that practice even back into the middle schools so that middle school parents can take ownership of what's going on with their kids. So if they see a great time of Grey's Anatomy and their kid says, hey, I want to be a surgeon, they know the maps of what to do around classes that need to take in high school, classes that need to take in college, and that leads to a pre-med degree. And also in terms of providing test preparation and other aspects of improving writing skills so that the kids indeed are ready for college. So it's those type of things that I've been trying to work with on the administrators in the Salt Lake area. So as one of my colleagues said from the UK, David Gilborn, and you should take a look at some of his work too. David Gilborn runs the Center on Race and Ethnicity at University of Birmingham in England. And he is the editor for the journal Race, Ethnicity, and Education. And David said, well, Larry, what are you doing in Utah, man? I mean, a CRT guy in Salt Lake City. And I said, Dave, I'm doing critical race theory missionary work. You know, I mean, that's what I'm doing. I mean, I'm trying to make some changes that can be missionary and revolutionary to change the ways in which our kids have just been underserved and not been served well by the public school systems and by higher education. So I'll just wrap it up there and then take any questions or comments, or people want to have some questions they want to ask me. I mean, I can go on like Fidel Castro here, you know, or...
If anyone has questions, I'm going to pass the mic. Are there any questions for Dr. Parker?
Good afternoon, Dr. Parker. My name is Carolyn Wadley. I'm an assistant principal here in Lubbock at 6 through 8 middle school, Old Slate Middle School, and I'm actually from Salt Lake City. And so I can attest to what it is that you're saying, because I do believe, I mean, I'm on board with your vision, that everyone, I mean, they need to be aware, especially our young students, about race. And I was having a conversation with an administrator this morning about some people get it, and some people just don't get it, you know. So I just want to applaud you. I went to East High School in Salt Lake City. So, I mean, I was one that I was not ready. I was not ready for college. And I feel as though if it is that I had someone like yourself reaching out to the schools, that it would have been, I mean, a really beneficial experience for myself. So I just want to tell you thank you very much for what it is that you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. And I appreciate the fact that you told me about your experience at East. East is one of the schools that I'm actually working with pretty heavily right now, because East is a potentially really great school if they can move away from the issues around, we've got to get our student athletes ready for college in that way around student athletics, and pleasing the East Bench predominantly white upper middle class parents. Because there's this way in which certain schools, I think this happens across the country, it's not only in Salt Lake, I think that there's certain schools that get into a comfort zone around, okay, if we can get a solid football team, we can get a solid basketball team, we can get kids involved in sports, other type of activities, and if we can please the upper middle class parents who will not get on our case, then everything else is fine. And it's unfortunate that a school like East, which has like about 2,500 kids, has gone into, I would like to say, a critical race theory laissez-faire mode, which is the leadership team takes care of those two groups, and everybody basically has to fend for themselves. And that really does a disservice to not only the kids of color, but the other kids who are just trying to make a normal life for themselves and to get into college. It means that the teachers are left to themselves. It means that there's no leadership that's really trying to move the needle around disrupting the normalization of failure patterns. And I think that that's where, that's one of the things that I'm trying to change in my new role as Associate Dean of the Honors College, which is to make it so that we really can do some serious change around not only getting some kids ready for college, but all kids ready for college, if that's what they want to do.
Are there any other questions or comments?
Hi, my name is Mabel Shadende. I'm a current sophomore here at Texas Tech, and classes like this, they're actually very needed on our campus. We don't have a lot of classes dealing with race. I mean, our history classes, like, professors were trying to talk about it, but I feel like we don't even have like a Black Studies program here on campus. We don't have a lot of things for like the African American community or people interested in race theories and ideas. So I was wondering, like, what advice would you give like a student like me who was wanting to bring more awareness to the issue of race, like, on this campus, and like, what advice would you give to all of us in general to push for like more classes here?
That's a great question. And I think that one of the things that we started here at Utah was, and Ryan is familiar with this, it's a Black Faculty and Staff Association, and that's been important for faculty of color to connect with each other, connect with efforts that they can do on campus to have summits and every year that talk about the state of race relations or the state of Black groups that are going on. I also think that it's important for the students to get together and start to create some coalitions. If the university is pretty much not going to do that at Texas Tech, I think it's going to be important to try to just engage in doing things on your own around student empowerment and student connections to what's important for you all, and then pushing those onto the central administration to see what can be done. I mean, I think that one of the things that the students have done here is that they have faced the same issues around the lack of attention related to race issues, diversity issues. The women's groups have been really adamant around trying to push for more attention paid to sexual harassment, sexual violence issues here on campus. And it's been a hard struggle because universities will say one thing, but they really have turned into institutions that will only respond when there's a crisis. And you don't want that to happen. You want universities to really respond to you. So it's really going to be important for students to get organized, because I always think that students, they will listen to students. They don't listen to faculty. I mean, that's for sure. I've been around this too long to think that they're going to listen to us. But they will listen to students if the students can present it, the discussions, and the points of criticism in pointed ways, particularly toward the provost and toward the president and to the boards of trustees, because those are the folks who make the decisions, as well as to the deans. The deans have to step up and start to do things. I also think it's going to be important to try to look at best practices at other places. So if there are other places that have examples of how this has been done, point that out to the administration. And it may not go anywhere, but at least they can't say that they haven't been told of other examples where things have been successful despite the odds. So I encourage you to do that. I say also form reading groups. Reading groups are always important to try to connect with too. And all power to you, all power to you.
We actually have a race relations event coming up on May 1st, I believe. And it's in this, but yeah, Dr. Parker, we are slowly doing the work. I know that you and I discussed before this event that I've been campaigning to get a critical race theory class added here at the university, so we'll see how that goes. But our first step is this event today and then the race relations event. We have another question.
Hi, Dr. Parker. Thanks for your talk. My name is Jordan Boteo. I'm a graduate student in our philosophy department, and one of my areas of interest is critical race theory and philosophy of race. But it seems to me like there's a gap between the philosophers who are doing critical race theory and the other scholars who are doing critical race theory. So my question for you is, do you think that there's an inherent contradiction between liberalism and critical race theory? Because critical race theorists who are in philosophy, like Tommy Shelby, think that they can use like Rawlsian notions of ideal theory and justice to attack racial injustice. Or people like Charles Mills at CUNY think that while the old notion of liberalism needs to have a revolution in the way that feminism revolutionized liberalism, that liberalism can still be salvaged by critical race theorists. I want to know your thoughts on that.
That's a really good question too. I like that question. And you're right, I have noticed that tension or schism in terms of how CRT's talked about in philosophy versus other areas. I think that there has been a healthy ideological tension that exists between those two takes. I would err on the side of looking at the evidence that is out there, particularly like some of the newer critics of CRT in the area of Afro-pessimism, like Michael Dumas, who's at Cal Berkeley. I would say that his work really comes more to trying to provide a criticism even of CRT through his examination and others, like Josh Sexton and others, who have talked about the ways in which there is an anti-blackness that happens worldwide that we can't ignore, and that it talks also about the bankruptcy of liberal theory to address this underlying notion of anti-blackness. And so I would say that I think that there's a split, and that split is healthy, and I think it's both. I can see both sides of it, but right now I think that I will see, given the context of 2019 and what we've got going on with number 45, and I won't go there because that'll take a whole long time. What I'm seeing now worldwide is this ways in which anti-blackness has to be part of the discussion around what it means for globally for people of color, and how it is that also that we need to take a look at what liberalism has to say about people who I call, who from my Muslim friends call, who are below black. And this is a term that they've been coining too, in terms of what happened after 9/11 to the Muslim community. And some of my Muslim scholars talk about how it is that they were essentially placed below blackness with respect to how they're treated by US society, how they're treated worldwide. And you can start to definitely see this in Europe in terms of what's going on there. I mean, there's all these different ways in which I think liberalism is is facing an upheaval, and it also doesn't address some of the issues around race, sexuality, and colonialism. And so I point to some of Lisa Lowe's work and her talk about intimacies in 4 continents, and that book that she wrote in, I think, 2015 as another source to take a look at on this particular topic. I gotta go, unfortunately, Jasmine.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Parker. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
It's so nice to see you.
Take care. Thanks a lot. Appreciate
Thanks, bye.
it. Bye-bye.
So Dr. Hodgkins and I will take the remaining questions if anyone has any.
Yes, my name is Chris Stahl, and when I fuse these ideas, you know, and these theories, you know, I kind of fuse it through my culture, you know, through the history of those who have come before me, and the fight that they have fought to deconstruct the Western ideas, you know, that have enslaved African Americans, you know, and the construct that it is founded upon, you know, especially in America, you know, and I think that we have to deconstruct those ideas, you know, and when I think about it, I think about, you know, the enslavement of African people, you know, who all they wanted to do, only thing the country wanted was their labor to enrich the country. You know, you think about all those people who was enslaved and how they did this, you know, through philosophy, you know, through intellectualism, you know, through these ideas that is in the academy, you know, when it comes to the bodies of African Americans, I think about, you know, Booker T. Washington, you know, Frederick Douglass, you know, that's how I fuse it. Then when I think about the intellectualism, you know, I think about W.E.B. Du Bois, you know, and Paul Robeson, you know, and they struggle in this American idea. You know, it's like we can go to these academies, you know, and we can talk these ideas of critical race theories and these different intellectual concepts, but somehow it doesn't get down to the masses, you know, and it's something that it seemed like it was an approach that we wasn't getting through, you know, that wasn't penetrating the whole idea of the foundation and the construct of what is going on in Western society. But then I think about, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King, you know, he came and he moved past the intellectualism, the enslavement, the working of the African bodies, you know, and he hit it from a spiritual perspective, you know, where I think a lot of the deconstruction has taken place. And it's a thing that we have to integrate into our whole concept when we talk about these concepts of critical race theory and all these other intellectual concepts, about how when he began to put a spiritual impact on that, which I consider truth, and it's coming from a man who is speaking truth, that's when we as African people move forward. And my whole question is, don't you think that we should integrate this spiritual aspect to the concepts that we are trying to integrate into our society to deconstruct the whole idea of the construct that has been constituted?
So that's an intriguing question. I am mindful that, so people can feel free to give refreshments during Q&A. So the question, so I am a professor in the College of Ed. I teach a critical race theory class in the summer. And so the context that I utilize is, how do you apply critical race theory to examine how the academy marginalizes, erases, and silences people, right? Mostly people of color. But to answer your question, spirituality, it is, due to capitalism, due to patriarch, due to the fact that racism is endemic, right? I believe that those white supremacy, those mechanisms exist to either monetize blackness in ways that allude to what you're talking about with chattel slavery, or even in what Dr. Parker is talking about it, that parallels my work dealing with black boys in football and routing them to sports fields to make money for the high school, right? Even at the institutional level, where players that are on basketball and football fields in college, they don't get paid for their likenesses or their jersey sales or any of those other things, right? And so spirituality has its place, but I found over time that prayer doesn't change systems, right? Resistance changes systems.
Well, you can't say that, you know, because when Martin Luther King was marching, he was like, he always depended upon these old black ladies who would pray for him, and he would always let us know that, like Mother Annie Pollard, you know, he was always appreciative of all those things that those women did for him and how they prayed for him. It's like spirituality hides itself, you know, from us, you know, because of who we are as beings. It's like we can't see it unless we are somewhat moved by it ourselves, or it is within us, you know. And so that's what I'm saying, you know. It's like, I think that's what brings out the truth, is because, you know, people look at us when we have these different theories as though we're coming to take what they have, and that their construct has been based upon a righteous way of life, that we should have been done what was done to us because of who we were as human beings. You know, I think that through the spiritual aspect of it, we can go back and challenge that idea and see what spirituality has done. You know, because all the races of the past, you know, the Jefferson Davises and those guys, you know, when they looked at us, they looked at us as less than human, as though God had put a mark upon us as human beings, that saying that we deserve to be enslaved. And they believe this spiritual aspect, you know, from biblical ideas, you know. And the thing about it is just that we believe the intellectualism, the scholarship that they were producing through spiritual and religious ideas. And I'm saying is, when I go back, and I think it's something that we need to do, and go back through and challenge those things. And I think when we challenge those things, we can see the untruth that was perpetrated upon us as people of color and on the world. And then it's like, to me, what they did was they profaned the name of God. You know, they totally crushed the holiness and the truth of who he is. And I think God had told us, you know, you're going to come a day, and the time is right now, where the true worship is the one who worship him in spirit and truth. And I think that's all we have to do, is tell the truth of history and to be righteous and true about it. And then I think we can really free ourselves. Okay, thank you. Someone else?
Okay. Related to that, I think to emphasize the spirituality as a motivation for the movement, I think you have to, in these days, kind of term it and put it in terms of ethics and morals. Haven't seen that done so much, say, with the immigration issues. If more personal stories were emphasized, then I think that would motivate people to make some changes. For instance, I read an article about, and of course you can't eliminate economics either. I read an article about, I think it was an article about North Texas town of Dumas, that had revitalized their small town decline by immigrants coming in and working there and just rebuilding the economy. And it had, revitalized the town. So, yeah, I think if we hear more stories like that, that emphasize the personal benefits that come from people that don't belong to the majority group, then I think that will help. I think it'll emphasize that spirituality, like you said.
You know, what my thought was is that I'm not speaking from the aspect of getting rid of finance and economics. I'm not talking about getting rid of critical race theories or ideas.
I'm simply saying that we must integrate it, because I think about when Obama ran the second time, about a month before he ran, I was watching ABC News Nightline, and I would listen to Cynthia McFadden. She was interviewing this young Ku Klux Klan guy from Mississippi, the Wizard. His name was Stephen Howard. And you guys can Google it right now, because I think it's still there. And so she was interviewing this guy, and he was saying, and she asked him the question, what do you think about black people? And Hispanics, and Jews, and he carried his gun on his side. He had his wife and his kids back in the woods of Mississippi, wearing hoods and burning crosses. He had served in the American military, and he came out and said, "Oh, I just hate black people. I hate Jews. And she said, "You carry this gun on your side every day?" He said, "Yeah, 24/7. And he said, "I'm a Christian." And he said, "We are not like these people. We as white people are different." And I was like, whoa, you're a Christian and you carry this sort of hate? He was totally perpetrating the whole idea of Christianity. And my thing is, he didn't understand what Christianity was. He was just going through the past, saying that the construct that white people have built, the construct in America, it was through the construct of religion, through the construct of Christianity. And I think we should challenge that, and that they were perpetrating the Creator, and we have to go back and deconstruct that kind of thinking.
I want to add something different, and that is, I know this is higher education.
No, go ahead.
I know this is higher education, but I know that Texas Tech has a significant early childhood education operation, a wonderful new building, and all kinds of studies. So I know that higher education has a connection to early childhood education, and I think that's the place to start. Everything, I like critical race theory, I know that's good, but I'd like to see it applied more and more at the preschool level, even first to 3, because now we know how critical that is. I mean, it's just determinative, and so it's not that it's exactly too late by the time you get to college, but a lot of work has already been done to put in place these old ways.
We have one more question.
Hi, I'm a professor of Spanish, Latin American literature and culture here at Tech, and my question is about, kind of relating to what the gentleman was saying about connecting stories of Latinx and immigrant populations here in the U.S. with stories of Black communities. And something I struggle with when I'm teaching about race from the perspective of Latinx studies, a Spanish department, is connecting the struggles of those people to Black communities in the U.S. So I'm wondering if any of the experts in the room can recommend a sort of introductory text, perhaps, to work on coalition building and to work on theoretically connecting the issues of Latinx communities and Black communities, and then also maybe speaking again about stories of immigrants and then stories of Black communities, maybe some sort of source for storytelling. I was really interested in what Dr. Parker said about storytelling, so I don't know who would want to answer that question, but.
Sure, thank you for the question. So right now I'm actually teaching a course on the Civil Rights Movement in the Honors College, and it's from the long Civil Rights Movement from the 1920s through the end of the 60s, early 70s, so the very long Civil Rights Movement. And within that, I'm teaching the course from a multiracial, multi-socioeconomic standpoint. Very deliberate in my doing that. Right now, my students are reading from the text by Lopez. It's called Racism on Trial, and it's actually about the Latinx community and their social movement of civil rights. And it ran parallel to the civil rights movement, and a lot of the vestiges of the Latinx movement came from the Black civil rights movement. There's also a book, and I'm going to preface this by saying that I'm a trained historian, interdisciplinary, so everything I recommend has history undertones. So there's another text on the U.S. history of Black and Latin America, specifically Latinx communities within America. So that book is really phenomenal, and it draws parallels between the African American civil rights movement, which was really for everyone. It was open for everyone, very inclusive, and it also talks about the social movement within the Latinx community. Dr. Hoskins, do you have anything to add?
I would be mindful, Dr. Parker mentioned sexting, Afro-pessimism, and anti-blackness. It is apparent to me in my work and research about history, about how when immigrant populations arrive in the United States, they are preconditioned to see Black people as deficit, right? And so there are these notions across all groups of people of color that intersects at what I call an attempt to seek white adjacency, and there are these issues that deal with colorism, right? And so there are, within the, it's speaking to students who are younger, who are part of the Latinx community and who are Black. Within the Latinx community, there are distinct differences based on the darkness or lightness of persons within those spaces that are tied to anti-Black ways or practices, and Black students are aware of this, right? And so I've heard in talking to students about these notions of how can we collaborate with the Latinx community, right, when within their community they experience the disdain for us that is perpetrated on themselves, right, around these notions of what it means to be dark and what it means to be light. I've, in watching just TV and sports, when I like baseball, right? So when I see brothers like Big Papi, I'm thinking, he's me, right? Because I rarely see Latinx people that are darker than I am, or darker than I am. And so when I see them as students in schools, they often have similar narratives of Black students about how they navigate whiteness and being isolated within class and outside of it. But I would encourage you to look into those spaces.
And I'm going to add to that the term Dr. Hoskins was talking about is colorism. A lot of the issues within the Latinx community with colorism stem from the fact that Latinx people in America are racially white unless they have lineage that traces through the African diaspora. Our legal system did not declare Latinx people as a race. You can look at the case Hernandez versus Texas for that. And within that case, litigators were arguing for the Latinx community to be racially classified as Mexican American. And that's because races, especially Black people, are a protected classification because of the historical discrimination, oppression at the hands of white people in society. And so Mexican Americans in Hernandez versus Texas argued for that same protected classification, and they did not get it. And when you read the transcripts, and coincidentally some of that is in the book, Racism on Trial, the litigators were asking different judges if they knew people who were Hispanic. And Hispanic is about the ability to speak Spanish. Being Latino, Latinx is about geographic location for a country within Latin America. And so in the transcript, the judges were being asked if they know people who are Latin American or Hispanic. And they were saying, sure I do, but they couldn't remember any names. And so a lot of the language was about names. It was about the use of language, immigration status, things that Dr. Parker spoke about in his talk. And so because of that failure to classify Mexican Americans as a race, Mexican Americans in America are racially white, and they have been throughout time. And so a lot of the nuances within Latin American communities, especially in America, is that when people of color, specifically Latinx people of color, argue that they are oppressed by white people, it's kind of a double-edged sword because they are oppressed by people who are just like them. The only thing that is different is perhaps the shade of their skin, but they're still white, and also language. And so it's a different argument versus black versus white because racially black people are a protected classification, whereas it's not that. Latinx people are an ethnic population, they're not a racial population. I'm going to take a couple of final comments. I am trying to keep to time because your professional development activity today is actually a case study that is multi-layered. You will need the handout in the center of your table, and I'm going to hand out a few other things. The last comment is Ms. Sarah Louie. Do you have anything to add? Okay, so if you could please just save your comments for small group.
It was really just, I mean, I'm no expert, but it was answering your last question. I would highly encourage you to more get out in the field, and then you can create your own story. I mean, I would encourage you to go into the schools, specifically the ones here locally, and kind of just see, I mean, the perspective and demographics and how it is that they're made up. A lot of that information you can get off the internet too, and targeting certain schools and demographics, but I'm talking about economically and ethnically too. So.
Thank you. Dr. Hoskins, could you please join me on the table? I'm going to read the case study to you to save a little bit of time. You will need to skim your specific case study at your table because a little bit of detail changes per table. The case study is on identity politics, critical race theory. And this case study bridges from the first workshop on white fragility. So hopefully you keep in mind some of the things you have learned from that text and then use what you apply from that text and today in order to complete this case study. So at this time, I'm going to read the case study. The Morrison family, a blank family from Houston, Texas, has always lived in the University of Houston / Texas Southern University neighborhood in historic 3rd Ward. Though they have moved twice before, they have remained tenants of the city's subsidized housing area. However, this summer, the neighborhood will begin its new massive gentrification project by big businesses that are coming in, tearing down Section 8 housing, and replacing them with upscale shopping centers, condominiums, townhomes, high-rise apartments, restaurants, amphitheater, and other luxury living and entertainment spaces. As a result, the Morrison family was given a $300 stipend by the city to assist in their relocation fee because with the improved quality of housing, rent will no longer be controlled. Therefore, the Morrisons will no longer be able to afford their neighborhood anymore, leaving them forced to move. So they have decided to relocate from Houston to Lubbock, a city / town that is 8 hours away. Here's the family background. Stephanie Morrison is a working mother. She will commute by carpool and bus to work. She shares the family car with her husband, Doug, a sales analyst in the United Supermarkets corporate office. Stephanie works 2 jobs in the city. One position is as shift manager of Walgreens, and the other as a part-time paralegal through a temp agency. Stephanie and Doug have been married for 17 years. Stephanie's take-home pay is just enough to get by. She pays for her work travel expenses, food, toiletries, and utilities to sustain the family of 4 every month. Doug pays the family's health insurance, the family's term life insurance, and their rent. Doug, a sales analyst for United Supermarkets corporate office, wakes up at 5:30 a.m. daily to arrive at work by 6:45 a.m. While in Houston working for HEB, Doug often worked extra hours to prevent him from living paycheck to paycheck and his family. However, as a new employee at United Supermarket's corporate office, Doug no longer qualifies for overtime opportunities because he is a new employee. Prior to being forced out of their home, Stephanie and Doug were saving roughly $200 per month to avoid living paycheck to paycheck. However, now that they have to relocate to Lubbock, they will likely spend more money. The couple has 2 children. One child is a boy named Dylan, he is 12, and then there's a 14-year-old girl named Emily. Given what you know about the family, I want each group to determine 3 residential areas to recommend the Morrison family for their relocation. 3 areas in Lubbock where they should move. Then I want you to recommend a school district for their children to go to. Friendship ISD, Lubbock ISD, or Lubbock Cooper. If you keep flipping in the case study, you will see there's a part 1 for each group. The part 1 will depend on which packet you are assigned. And then there is a part 2. Then there's a part 2, and each part 2 is the same. I'm going to go ahead and read the part 2 questions. Did you consider race, the race of the family, when selecting the neighborhood? Why or why not? Did you consider the race of the family when selecting the school district or particular schools for the children? Why or why not? And did you notice any prejudicial, discriminatory, racist thoughts in your decision making? If so, what were they? I want to remind everyone that in order to undo racism, we have to be honest. So please do be honest as you complete this case study. To help you out with determining school districts, I have pulled real Texas Education Agency data from the website for each school district, okay? And that is at the back of your case study. At this time, to assist Dr. Hoskins, I'm going to pass out markers and poster paper for you all to complete your answers on. If you have any questions, just stop us at any time. And you're going to have about 25 minutes to complete this activity, and any group who wants to present their answers can at the end of our workshop. Thank you. The last thing I want to add is that while I did create this case study and the family is fake, the information is real. I pulled an article from Houston Business Journal that I'm going to disseminate. 3rd Ward in Houston, Texas, as of December 19th, 2018, just a few weeks ago, has a 90% probability of gentrifying. everyone. I do want us to be cognizant of time. I'm pretty sure that most groups are not done with the case study, and that's fine, but you're done. So if anyone wants to present their decisions, then feel free to do that. I can bring the mic over to you if you're comfortable with that. If you're not done, then keep working if you want. I don't want to hold people late, so if you have to leave, that's fine. And I definitely get that. But I do want everyone to have opportunity to work through the case studies if they want to, so that they can look at and consider things that they had not previously. Would you all like to present?
Okay, we have our first table. Presenters. This table right here. They're called the Mavericks. So who's talking first? Okay. Stand up, say your name so everyone knows who you are and where you're from.
My name is Adrienne Carnes and I'm with the College of Business. Okay, so first question was, what was the first question? Oh yeah, the neighborhood. I put Waters. Y'all know where Waters neighborhood is? 78th in Indiana. So I put Waters School District. I put LASD. The reason that we picked that school or that area location was because we considered that somebody's going to have to use public transportation, and I know that the bus stop's right there on Indiana and 82nd. Also, Evans and the high school that the children would be going to, they can ride the bus because they're within that specific mile radius. And then things that we considered, what details affected your decision, we just looked at logistics. What would be the easiest on the family? You know, how could the students get to school? What was easiest for the parents to commute? The father works at the United corporate office, and that's at 82nd Quaker, so it wouldn't be much of a commute. Maybe if he used the public transportation system. And then what results would your choice have on the entire family? We just tried to make it convenient and as easy as possible for the family. And then part two, did you consider the race of the family? We did not. Did you consider the race of the family when selecting the neighborhood, school district? I didn't. And then did you notice any prejudicial thoughts in your decision making? No, we didn't.
Can you tell us what race or ethnicity your family is?
White. Yes, white.
White. And what is the school district?
LASD.
Okay. Thank you. Would anyone like to ask them questions or comment on anything? Is there a reason you did not consider race?
We went straight from a problem solving. I think we went straight from a problem solving, logistically, how are they going to get through their day kind of approach. We know that certain areas of the city that there's not public transportation, so that's kind of what helped us narrow it down first. Is how are the parents going to get to their job? We started with that. That's kind of most important, is how are they going to work? And so that narrowed it down for me already. Is they're going to have to be, you know, in kind of central Lubbock area. And I chose Waters because that's where my kids go to school. And I kind of know how things work around there. I know that the bus stops close. I know where all the middle schools and high schools are. I know that students can ride the bus. So I just, like, it was just logistics. How do we get this family where they need to be? Thank you.
Okay, so we're from the College of Education, and so we talked a lot about location and the neighborhood, and for us, we obviously were future educators. We thought one of the most important things was making sure that the kids were in a good area to go to school, so that was kind of our main priority, and then we talked about the same thing about the parents being able to get to work. So we came up with 4 possible neighborhoods. So we had Ballinger, which is 50th and Q, South Mesa, which is 82nd and P, South Overton, which is actually really close to the university, and then Heart of Lubbock, which is 27th and Keel. All of these have really good access to bus stops. Most of them are really close to schools, so the kids can ride the buses. And I think, are all of them LISD? Most of them are LISD, which we work with a lot. I know a lot of us are student teaching at these schools, so we're pretty involved and we know a lot about the areas. We're college students, so we said, we don't know a lot about real estate and stuff, but we just kind of tried to go where we knew. But like we said, our main priority was making sure that the kids got into good schools. And yeah, we talked a lot about safety, because you never, if you want them to walk to school, if you want it, one of the parents is going to have to be walking. Yeah, we decided the dad would walk to work, and the mom would take the car. And then, I don't know, Colin kind of started talking about just things going on in Lubbock. He was like, Rager Dykes is probably going to be.
We were just talking since it is cheaper to live in Lubbock, and since a certain car dealer is going out of business, they're liquidating cars real cheap, so it probably won't take long for them to save up for a second car and fee. And then our family was Latino, and we didn't really think about that. We didn't realize it halfway through, oh, our family's Latino. But the most important thing we were thinking of was cost efficiency. It's what's going to get them back on their feet the fastest after relocating to Lubbock.
And then also the children, making sure that they have safety and that it was in a good school district. And then normally trying to show conversation we had was the stereotypes and prejudice that they know with the different high schools and stuff. Escado, they always say if you want to play sports, you go to Escado. If you want to get a good academic.
We just talked about the different prejudice and stereotypes that come with the different high schools in the different areas. So, a thing in LISD is people say, oh, if you want to play sports, you need to go to Estacado, but if you want good academics, you should go to Lubbock High. Which isn't always the case, but that's just what people think. That's just a stereotype.
Got another table, Dr. Parker.
How you doing? Of course, we're not students, but we did participate, and we don't have a name for our group, but I think our point was that before you start talking about neighborhoods, we felt you had to look at factors. This was a white family who lived in a depressed part of Houston, Texas, which is primarily Hispanic and Black. They don't have money to stay there. Economically, they're challenged, even though they're coming here for a better life. So we looked at these factors first, and so we had to look at, okay, so where could they find a house? They can't buy a house based on the facts. They cannot buy a house. They'll have to, probably not now. They'll have to live in subsidized housing, so hence Section 8. Where are the Section 8 homes? Well, the best Section 8 home you can find is probably going to be in the southern part of Tech Terrace, 31st and 33rd Street. Most Tech Terrace is way overpriced. You guys know that because you live here. Those houses are way overpriced. But if you can find a Section 8 house there that's good, and they have a good school system from Hutch or O.L. Slayton, those are good school districts. The other part, Stewart and Stubbs. I know from working in the Housing Authority and being on the Local Housing Finance Corporation, you have many of your subsidized houses are over there near Coronado. They're probably going to get subsidized housing. If they try to get rent, some of your students, you pay rent, and your rent's expensive. So that's not helping them. So they'd have to try to find a home, an actual structure. Okay, Dunbar Cherry Point. This is a white family, but so what? So what? Dunbar Cherry Point has a lot of homes that they're nice, people overlook, subsidized homes, and school district, their middle school now, Dunbar's having challenges, but Estacado has an early college admission program that if you go there, you get your college paid for. And that's going to help the family out. Great deal. The challenge is that we wanted to find a place where they could actually have good bus service. And the places we mentioned have good bus service except East Lubbock. That's the only downside. And that's not right. But anyway, so I'm tying this all in. We looked at presumably, since they lived where they lived in Houston, we presumed that they would be okay living in a black Hispanic majority neighborhood. And so that's an assumption we made. So that's all I'm going to share. You guys? Okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we got another group.
We chose Lubbock Independent School District because I work for the LISD. But we thought LISD represented the better school district because it had more diversity. LISD has more diversity in terms of racial diversity, ethnic diversity, and also economic diversity. We felt that the family would do better living in Lubbock. They have access to resources in the city. They would have access better to Texas Tech and Lubbock Christian University for the college overlay. And so, generally speaking, we chose LISD because they would have just an increased range of opportunity, period, in the city. We didn't focus on trying to decide on the neighborhood and that kind of thing. We didn't see that as a charge. We felt that that would be something that they would fit into their economic reality and make that determination. So we didn't go that far. And that's it.
Thank you.
Would anyone else like to, go ahead.
Really, more the reason is because we were the outlier here and did not pick LISD. Although I work for LISD. Don't tell anybody. The first thing that I'll say I looked at is I looked at math and reading scores per district. And really what we did is we ranked them 1, 2, and 3 between the three school districts. And one thing that someone had mentioned, so are these the only 3 school districts that were given? Is yeah, because these are the bigger ones I assumed, which there are some great ones, outside of Lubbock. But we looked at those 3 and noticed that Lubbock Cooper was #1 in math and reading. We also looked at one thing that Lubbock ISD is doing is getting our students college ready. And so when we looked at SAT and how many students were given the SAT and the ACT, I think it was like a slash, but 95% of the students, at least it was that college readiness was what it was. We also looked at how it is that money is allocated within a district, as well as we did think about location. And as it is that the intake process, the enrollment and withdrawal process with the particular middle school that I'm at, we do have, for the most part, 95% of our students are low socioeconomic, and they do come from Friendship. They do come from Cooper. And so it's more of getting to know them a little bit more. You're able to understand that there is affordable housing for students within Cooper, also within Friendship. They're not homeowners, but it's more renters is what it is. I don't know how tough it is to find, but I know there is affordable housing. Also, of course, we mentioned the academics. Looking at the data, it is the best. And I know you mentioned, is it Davis? Yes, with Estacado Early College, there are students that are able to put in transfers. So if they don't live within the Estacado feeder pattern, there are students that come from the west side and attend Estacado for the early college program, as well as Talkington too. So that's another thing, if it is, that's something that is available. So really the first thing that we looked at was, hey, let's look at math and let's look at reading, and let's try and build those kids up through that. The bus, it runs right along 82nd, which I hope that tabling kind of stuck around, but we didn't look at the location necessarily. I thought the headquarters for Market Street, it was on the east side. But, there is a bus that runs right along 82nd. I like y'all's idea, and have the dad take the bus to figure it out. Thank you.
I would challenge, I would challenge that there's a good amount of affordable housing in Cooper or Friendship districts, because there are some, but it's very limited. And then I think we made an assumption that these kids, the math scores, they're going to be able to compete. We don't have facts on that. So I think we went to, where probably syndrome kids, I'm just saying just in general, I wonder, I question that hard to get to, and they have one car. And the further you get outside of Lubbock, the less busing is there.
Right, and the further south that it does go is 82nd, so that's why I mentioned that.
The furthest it goes is 82nd.
We're talking about for the public transportation, is that what you're referring to?
I am, and so Cooper's, as you know, is way out. It's way out, way past
They
us.
also provide busing for their students.
And so, of course, excuse me?
I said they provide busing for their students as well as in Wolford. And
Yeah.
so I live in Wolford District, the Wolford ISD District, and I do live in a community where it is affordable. Because before becoming faculty, I did have to manage my money, single mom of 4 kids. And so I know what it's like to have to go through the system and have to consider the schools that my kids go to. And my kids did go to LISD, Lubbock High, and I did not. My experience was not great for my kids. My experience personally was okay. My kids' experience was not great. And so I did look for a better school before I thought about the neighborhood that I live in, before I thought, how am I going to get to work? How are my kids are going to get to work? How are my kids going to get to school? The academics played a major part in that.
Thanks for sharing that. What neighborhood were you in?
West End. I lived and I grew up in the Arnett Benson area.
No. I'm asking when
Meow?
you lived in, when you moved out to Friendship.
I live right here in West End, right outside the Loop, and we are.
You know the West End, like where the Nike outlet is?
What is
The
it?
Nike outlet, where
Yes.
the Nike outlet is, in that area.
Oh, there's a affordable, oh, I see.
There
back
is,
on
there is.
the wall.
Yes, sir.
On the wall, okay, I know what you're talking about. Okay.
So it's all from this way all the way, and then it's Wolford, but you're still in Lubbock. So it kind of works out.
Thank you for sharing your narrative with us. This is a part of critical race theory, counter-narrative storytelling. Would any other group like to go? I do have a question for you to ponder. I wonder if any of you looked at the student demographics of the district and then compared it to the teaching force, because that is on the back of every form for every district. So some districts have, for instance, 1-point-something% Black students and 0.2% Black teachers for their entire district. So I wonder if you looked at that data.
And also, before Donna speaks, if you look at the data, I want you to question, does that matter? Does it make a difference? Especially if you have a Black family, does it make a difference if you're putting your kids in a district that has 0.2 Black teachers?
Okay, yeah, we had a Black family. Our group did not have a name, so we thought about the first thing I think before even picking the neighborhood was the school, and we had initially we were leaning more towards friendship, but then we had to remind ourselves that we do have a Black family, and some of the members on our table have grown in Lubbock their whole lives. And they said the word out is Friendship is a white school, and Cooper is even whiter than Friendship. So they said Lubbock High is a lot more diverse. And so that made us to go towards Lubbock High School. And then with getting Lubbock High School now, the next thing was to figure out how's transportation going to work. And so we're looking at an area whereby the bus service is easy to get to, and also the kids can literally walk to the different schools that are out there. So the heart of Lubbock was, we selected that, and it runs from 19th to 34th University to Avenue Q. So we did consider race quite a bit in our choice and the ease of getting to work. And since you read from the story, I think that they had one car. We figured out one person can drive to work. So one person can drive to work and the other person can take the bus, depending on however they decide to do that. So that was it. But we're leaning more towards the dad driving to work because there's a Walgreens just around I think 50th and Q. So we're looking at the mom can ride the bus and the dad probably drive. We didn't check out where the United corporate headquarters was.
Thank you. Last group?
Well, I wasn't going to really go over our paper. We have an Asian family that had moved from Houston, and so we did pick the Friendship District because it has a real high population of Asian families within that district, within the school. And, okay, I was trying to, sorry about that. But we had an Asian family that had moved from Houston, and they were living on Section 8 when they were in Houston. But based on the family and some of the income that they have now, they probably wouldn't qualify living in Lubbock, Texas, because the Houston prices and everything are way more, and the economic status here would be way cheaper. So I doubt very seriously if they would still remain in Section 8. So they probably moved to where they wanted to.
Does anyone have any other questions, comments? Yes.
You know, I think that's a great point. We talked about Section 8 and Charles indicated that they may not qualify. And then we have sales tax. See, exactly. So I was on the board at the time. So here's the deal, is that so if you look at the house, the cost per square foot house, and you compare them to Dallas, we pay more in Lubbock. And so the question is, can they actually afford a home here? And that's going to be the real challenge. And Houston is less neighborhood. So the point is that people really come to Lubbock. Like I moved from Los Angeles. I thought, so you're probably going to have like 5 acres and horses. I said, no, it's not quite like that. You know, it's not cheap. We don't have cheap housing, most of the housing. So it's going to be a challenge for them to get housing. Would you agree with that? And then now, but she's working 2 jobs, but the fact is that she barely makes, that barely makes things happen. And so even though he's working for United, we can assume that he's making money. He can't get overtime. HEB got overtime, so he could have made more money there. So I'm just saying, it's a challenge. Yeah.
We have a comment over here. Okay, hi guys, I'm Amber. I'm a graduate student. I'm an interdisciplinary master's student. But I just wanted to comment, I've never really thought about the different ways that critical race theory can be used with other, races or other groups of people. But I still want to just make the clarification, just when we talked about it on Friday at this event, when you talk about people of color, if you're specifically talking about things that only happen to Black people, you might want to specify that. And so that's why I think it's important to see the different levels of how this theory may apply, when you consider schools or things like that. But for our table, we had to consider race a little more heavily, just based on the relation between Black people specifically, not just people of color. So just whenever you're talking about things like that, try to talk about which group of people of color you're talking about. Just kind of a note.
And what are some of the differences that Black families have to consider? I mean, I can name a few off the top of my head. Will my child be treated nicely and fairly? Will they be recognized for their intellect and tested for gifted and talented? Will they try to say that they should go to special education because they have a behavioral problem? Will they label my child as bad instead of really just getting to know them or talking to me about them? Will I be treated well in this residential neighborhood, or will my neighbors isolate me or make me feel like I do not belong? Will my teachers for my children be Black? Will they have people who look like them teaching them? Will they be discriminated against by administration? It's a number of things that Black people have to consider, and that's why critical race theory helps. It also helps when looking at the Latinx community, because
You have teachers who will say, I'm not speaking in Spanish, you need to know English or Chinese or whatever other language, or they will try to retain them, hold them back for whatever reason. So there are a lot of different nuances, and critical race theory helps. White fragility also helps people to acknowledge their discriminatory behaviors or racism and where that lies so that they will correct that behavior.
My point kind of touches on what you were just talking about. Our class is a like a teaching in diversity class. And so one of the things I went through and I circled at each of the schools, so Friendship ISD has a 3.8 for English language learners, 3.9 for bilingual ESL, but they only have a 2.3 of teachers who are bilingual ESL, which is actually, I think, the highest out of all of them. The lowest is Lubbock Cooper. They have a 2.4 ESL, a 2.4 bilingual, but they only have a 0.8 for teachers who are bilingual or ESL certified. And then I guess Lubbock ISD is in the middle. But for us, we had a Hispanic family, we didn't get the details whether or not they were, ESL or bilingual or anything like that. But if you did want to take that into consideration, then the best, if they wanted their kids, to be able to work with those people, they would have a better chance at friendship rather than Lubbock Cooper, who only has a 0.8. That's a very low number for kids who need those resources.
But so to add to that, I arrived in the fall of 2016, and so all my colleagues said that my children need to be in Friendship School District, right? And so be mindful of the hyper surveillance of the black body, right? And so when I lived in Salt Lake City, so Dr. Parker was on my committee, and so we go back. But when I was in Salt Lake City, so I'm a runner, and I usually run at night, right? And so in my neighborhood, for the longest, we were the only black family in the neighborhood, so I don't run in my neighborhood at night, right? For a variety of reasons that are around safety, right? And so my daughter goes to Friendship High. She's never had a black teacher, and so it is challenging, right? So I think that part of systemically, CRT allows us to unpack these false narratives that wherever whiteness is housed, the quality of school learning is in that same building, right? But for our children, sometimes we are erased, right? I always say that if a student's not in the class, how can they learn, right? As a teacher, I think it is an adept skill to have to teach that class regardless, right? Teachers have the subjective latitude to send a child to the office. And that child's not learning while they're in the office, right? And so just be mindful that children need to see themselves. I was telling my wife the other day, I haven't seen black children running and playing in the neighborhood like the neighborhood I grew up in, right? And so my children know how to navigate whiteness better than I do. And I'm still wrestling with what is the quality of education, right? My daughter's learning in class, but what is she learning about what it means to be constructed as a black girl in that school where black girls are rarely absent and no black women teach or are administrators in that building? So just mindful of that too.
Yeah, before you speak, let me add to that. When I was moving here, I hadn't visited when I accepted the position, and my colleagues too, Dr. Hoskins and I both work in the College of Education. My colleagues as well recommended Friendship ISD as an area where I should move. And so I moved there not knowing where I should, where it was. So that's where I live. And I happened to be outside within the first 3 weeks of my moving here. And I was checking the mail, and a random neighbor saw me outside and approached me. And she started subtly, and this is mentioned in White Fragility, she started subtly talking about how neighbors in the community were a little bit because I was standing checking my mail. So she was saying that my subdivision would bring more crime, more, she never said people of color or black people specifically. That's aversive racism mentioned in the book. But she just talked about crime, and the area would become a sketchy area. And I looked at her and I paused because, again, my body is hyper-policed as a black person, as a black woman. I am at the bind, the double bind. I'm a triple bind because I'm young. But I looked at her and I just said, I'm not on Section 8 housing. If you're asking, I do not believe my area is Section 8 housing. I know I'm black, thank you. I have a mirror. But I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to live in peace, thank you. But that was Friendship ISD, and that was my welcome 3 weeks in. So these are things you have to consider when you don't have people in the schools who look like you, or, you know, if you're at our level and you're looked at as an outlier. I teach in the honors college right now, and I have a black student who's graduating this semester. She told me specifically she enrolled in the class so that she can say she had a black professor in college. I am her first, and she is graduating.
Just to kind of go off what you guys were talking about how young kids of color, especially black children, need to see themselves in schools. I wrote a paper for my diverse students class about diversity, and I put a statistic in there saying that if a black student has a black instructor, their chances of graduating and going to a four-year university goes up 13%. And if they have 2 black instructors, their chances go up to 32%. So it's very important for I'm going to say me because I'm kind of like in that statistic. It's important because I grew up in Lubbock, and elementary school I had black teachers, but when I went to middle school and high school, not one. The only black employees were either lunch ladies or custodians. Yeah, I went to Talkington. I'm a Talkington student. Yeah, and there's a black assistant principal now, but that's like, what, like 8 or 9 years after the fact they opened, so it's slowly but surely.
Nefertiti, did you have some?
Oh, sorry.
What I will say is that Dr. Hoskins passed out this supplemental packet. It does not necessarily help with this case study, but this is a study just released last week by Ed Bill. And Ed Bill talked about this $23 billion gap. The $23 billion is the disparity between white student allocations of funding versus students of color funding. Are there any last comments, questions?
Let me clarify. The course that I teach at CRT is in the summer, July 9th to August 9th, graduate level, 5301. So if you want your thinking complicated, come out at me.
Thank you so much for attending. You're going to receive a post-event survey in a couple of hours. I think it will be automatically distributed at 3:30. So you'll receive that. Our next event is on April 17th, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. It is inside of the library on the first floor in the Teaching, Learning, Professional Development Center, room 151. And that is on #WordsMatter, addressing discriminatory subtext. For instance, my racist neighbor who never mentioned race, but the subtext was there that I did not belong. So we'll be discussing that April 17th. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.